So, till the previous session we actually had been seeing different kind of tools that we could use as a penetration tester for doing an attack from the client side. So, starting from this session onwards we are going to see a few of the tools that could potentially be used for doing an authentication based attack, right. So, before we actually look at the tools we would first try to find out and understand what exactly we mean by authentication here, and try to get a clarity on that so that it becomes more clear when we talk about using the different type of tools for doing a authentication based attack. So, authentication is basically a mechanism by which one end of the connection or one end of the data transfer that is going to happen basically tries to confirm the identity of the other end, right. So, either it could be a one way authentication or it could be a mutual authentication, wherein the client could basically be challenged by the server asking the client to authenticate itself, that in which case it is called as a one way authentication. Here the client alone authenticates itself and then proves to the server that it is really the legitimate party when it is actually trying to establish a session with it, right. On the other hand, there is also what is called as a mutual authentication, where after the client has got itself authenticated successfully, it will not stay quiet, but then it will try to challenge the server, asking the server also to prove itself before the actual data transfer can really happen, right. So, in that kind of a scenario, it is basically referred to as a mutual authentication, because both the ends are actually trying to authenticate each other one after the other, right. So, the client will first get challenged and then it will be proved to authenticate itself. Once it is successful, the client will not leave it as it is, but then now the client will go and ask the server and challenge it, saying that authenticate yourself, right. Only after the server also has got authenticated successfully by the client, the actual data transfer will establish and then the data will get transferred. Now, we find that this kind of a mutual authentication or a two way authentication is used in protocols like CHAP, in which both sides will authenticate itself. Now, whether it is a one way authentication or a two way authentication, so this basically helps us to understand that authentication is nothing but a sort of act of confirming the trust of the identity, right. So, the identity of the other party that is actually trying to establish a communication connection with it. So, this can confirm the identity of a person or a program or a hardware, right, and so on and so forth. So, depending on what kind of authentication I am actually trying to do, I could for example say that the XYZ person is actually a government employee, and as well as he is basically right now trying to establish a session from a laptop which has actually been issued by the government agency only, right. So, all these kind of different permutations and combinations are possible before I basically tell this particular party XYZ is to be given these kind of privileges henceforth, as long as this particular session is available. So, as a penetration tester, what will one try to do is, it will basically the tester will try to gain the trust of a system, and using the trust that it has been gained right now, the tester will basically try to bypass the security subsequently. So, this is what will be the objective of a penetration tester trying to do or trying to attack a authentication based system. Now, to give an idea about the different kinds of authentication, so if I basically take as a reference point the CISSP curriculum, right. So, they basically try to say that authentication could be based on 3 factor types. One is something which is actually known, like a PIN or a password, that is basically known without any kind of a physical entity. The second one is something which I actually have, something like a password, like a smart card, and the third one is something which I physically possess, like a fingerprint that I need to actually make use of. In most of the times we will actually find out that there are now requirements where I will actually need to make use of more than one factor authentication together before I get a successful entry into that particular system, right. So, the most common method that is actually used is by asking the person or the entity to type in the password, but since password could be also be very easily cracked, we have now having things where I typically use something called as a multi-factor authentication, right. So, meaning a combination of multiple authentication. So, once I type the password, I will now get sort of an SMS on my mobile phone. I need to type the PIN number that I am getting on the mobile phone before the entire authentication is successful. So, using the multi-factor authentication, we would actually be able to sort of doubly or triply ensuring that the entity that is actually trying to represent somebody is really the person, right. So, for example, we all would have seen right now when we do a e-commerce transaction, you would always have first level of authentication to be the credit card number details and so on, and then it is not going to accept the details as it is, but it is now going to say that a PIN number has been generated and sent as an SMS or as an email, right. So, based on the PIN number or the password getting entered is also matching with what has been generated at that instant of time, the authentication is then going to become successful. Now, in order to ensure that these kind of PIN numbers are not reused with something like a replay attack, right. The validity of the PIN number is further enforced, saying that this PIN number is actually valid only for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it is, right. So, this PIN number has got to be entered, the second factor authentication that is employed here has got to be entered within that validity period, because after that particular period the PIN number is not going to be considered as valid. So, likewise we actually have a multi-factor authentication that is predominantly employed today in various kinds of systems to do the complete authentication, so that even if one of the factors is compromised, the compromised person is not affected, because the second factor is also there, wherein the illicit transaction could actually be prevented. So, it is very common that the user authentication basically involves both username and password combination, and because of the fact that it becomes very cumbersome for a user to remember this combination every time the authentication is required, what has actually started happening is there is something called as an SSO. SSO basically stands for a single sign on, and with this single sign on I could basically have a central database or a central authority which is actually trusted by all the websites, all the systems, all the users in the network, because once this single sign on server basically validates the user, saying that yes, he is actually a user who has been successfully authenticated, then that particular credentials could be actually used from multiple systems at the same time, right. So that I do not need to actually keep entering the username password for every system that I am actually trying to access subsequently. Now, anything that you centralize like this, it's actually a very big pleasure point for a person like a penetration tester. Why? Because the moment he is successful in attacking and compromising this centralized database or centralized authority, now penetration tester can have a big laugh, because he is now going to be able to successfully get access to all the systems that actually trust this particular centralized server, right. So, while the single sign on gives a lot of convenience for the users in order to not to make them keep typing the username password combination in multiple places whenever they are accessing the different resources, we also have to understand at the back of our mind that it is something which is very critical in terms of the security point of view, and it has to actually be very hardened, so that the penetration tester will find it extremely difficult to attack and compromise that server, right. So, in that case we will have to be more careful. One of the other mechanisms that is generally adopted to prevent this authentication related issues is that the web application will always have a session. So, a session is basically a time that is actually defined in which the user could potentially spend on a particular website. If you are really talking of a website application as a system here, and for which he will be considered as a valid authenticated user, after which he will need to re-authenticate himself, right. So, for example, let us say I am basically going to an e-commerce portal and I have authenticated myself initially with respect to whatever login password that needs to be used, and that particular e-commerce portal as a requirement that I could actually take this credentials for 5 minutes, right. But let us say I find it very difficult decision to make on what I need to purchase from the e-commerce portal, and I keep going back and forth among the different pages, and the moment of the duration of 5 minutes is crossed, the website is now going to again go challenge me and ask me to authenticate, because the validity of that session that it has created based on the first set of credentials given was only 5 minutes, and I as a user has actually crossed 5 minutes, right. So, this is something which is actually used to prevent from attackers making use of sessions session related details which has been captured earlier, okay, maybe yesterday what has been captured, and try to replay it today and then take advantage of it as if it is a valid session, right. So, based on these parameters we keep seeing that authentication is something that is actually very seriously taken up with multi-factor authentication, then having a time based time duration based session management also, right. So, from a objective of a penetration tester, what is it that he is going to actually have as a goal? So, he basically has a goal of identifying the accounts that are permitted access to sessions with very high level privileges, and also have unlimited time to access the web application. So, that is basically will be his target, to find out what are all the accounts that he can compromise which has high privileges. And secondly, in addition to the high privileges, the attacker with those accounts can also spend an unlimited amount of time to access the web application and do all that he wants there as a malicious user, right. So, that is why we actually have very stringent mechanisms like session timeout intervals and SSL certificates, all which has become very mandatory for any kind of a session that is actually getting established, any of the website applications that is being developed in today's market. So, there are tools that are actually available in Kali Linux which can identify the flaws in how the sessions are managed. It could there are tools that could actually capture an active session on a web application, and once it has actually captured a session, it could then try to actually make use of it for another person, right, what we refer to as a session fixation attack. So, session management attacks can also basically have vulnerabilities in applications on how users access and authenticate those applications also. So, these kind of things would be potentially leveraged by the different kind of tools that is actually available in Kali Linux. So, one of the things that is actually referred to is what is called as a clickjacking, right. So, clickjacking is basically a technique where an attacker will sort of try to give a false impression or sort of trick the user, making him think that he is actually clicking something some site, but actually it will lead him to some other site. So, this is what is referred to as a clickjacking, where in normal non technical terms it is also referred to as a phishing, where the user might think that he is actually trying to go to a site, but the actual redirection will be to another site which has been made by the attacker. Now, if you look at it here, while the message will say for visit us on facebook.com, the actual URL with which it will be href2 will be actually badfacebook.com or some other site, right. So, this is actually just an example that has been given here. So, the moment the user comes and clicks on this hyperlink, it is going to become a hyperlink because it has been used as a href here. While the text is actually showing it as a facebook.com, the user will be actually taken up to another site called badfacebook.com, which is what is href'd here, right. So, if the badfacebook.com site is going to have the same look and feel of facebook.com, the user is not going to be aware that he has actually been taken to another site and he is now going to enter the credentials there, right. Now, this particular site will actually take the credentials, store it, and then do a transparent redirection to facebook.com without the user being aware of this entire middleman who are actually doing this dirty trick, right. So, that is the reason why it is always advisable in today's world, if you want to be very secure, the moment you go and try to click on a hyperlink, always to look at the status bar of your browser window below, which will tell you exactly what is the URL to which it is mapped, right. And only if you do not find anything suspicious on that URL to really click on that href link, right. Yes, it is agreed that it will take you more time for verification and then clicking and all that, but this is much better rather than having your credentials compromised by going into some site which is actually not authenticated or not the intended site that you wanted to visit. So, I could also go ahead and try to have web sessions cookies hijack. So, as we know by now, cookies are basically a very small piece of data that my browser typically stores, and it is first sent from a website and subsequently stored on a web browser when the user, whenever the user is actually trying to access the website, right. So, the website can basically go ahead use a cookie to verify if the user who is actually right now coming into this particular website has originally come into the site before, or is he a first time visitor to the site, right. So, based on that the impression that the website can give to the visitor could appropriately change. Like for example, we go to amazon.com, and tomorrow if I go to amazon.com again, it basically tells me that last time I came to amazon.com I actually did these things, right. So, all these kind of details are actually stored and retrieved as part of a cookie information that is present. So, there are actually tools that are actually available to play around with cookies and sort of hijack the cookies also. So, cookies can basically include the tracking history from users for long periods of time, including behavior on a website years ago, right. So, this is what we were actually discussing now about giving an example of amazon.com. So, cookies can also store passwords in some places which are not that secure and form values a user has previously filled, right. So, all these kind of things are very dangerous from a penetration testing point of view or from a attack point of view, because once the cookie is determined, I get all the details that are stored in the cookie, maybe my password, maybe my validity, maybe my credit card number, maybe my telephone number, whatever it is, and then the attacker or the hijacker could actually make use of it in whatever form he or she wants it, right. So, basically while cookie gives a better look and feel and a better customer experience, we need to understand that having cookies being used as part of our website application opens up a Pandora's box as far as the security is concerned, because these basically becomes very good entry points by which the penetration tester could actually sort of get a cookie from your session which you used 1 month before, extract data, then regenerate the cookie and then reuse it at his own sweet duration of time that he is expecting to use, and then your entire login access into that particular website is completely compromised. So, there are some limitations of hijacking the sessions through these kind of cookies. So, because most of the cookies today are basically accessed using HTTPS from the browser. So, in which case there is an end to end encryption that is there. So, if that is being done, then it basically becomes difficult from the penetration tester point of view, or more effort is actually required and more time is required from a penetration tester side to actually try to extract the details out of it. So, most of the cookies today are basically programmed to also expire whenever the user basically logs out of a session. So, if this has been done, then the cookie itself becomes invalid and it has been actually made available only for that particular session, right. So, in these kind of scenarios it becomes very difficult for the penetration tester to use the cookie. If these kind of things have not been made use of, then the penetration tester could actually make use of this to get very secure information that you could potentially make use of subsequently for doing the attack on that particular website. Thank you.